Hello friends, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be speaking at Proclaim this year, 2021. Our theme for the conference is Unreached, Reached Africa, Reaching Unreached Africa. And you and I have the pleasure of having heard the gospel, and it's our responsibility to take it to those who have not. And as we take it, we may encounter a few challenges here and there, and that is the focus of our workshop today. Missionaries or colonialists? The people who brought the gospel to Africa, were they missionaries or were they simply agents of colonialism? But before I begin what we have for today, I'd like to just introduce myself. My name is Allan Muchiri. I am married and I have been blessed, my wife and I have been blessed with 3 wonderful children. And I am a pastor with the Africa Inland Church, just at Ngong Road. And I am a teacher of the history of Christianity at the Africa International University, and I'm also pursuing a PhD in world Christianity at the same institution. With that out of the way, I'd like to jump into a story first. An interesting story. The year is 1605. Roberto di Nobili is an Italian Catholic priest, and he's going to India as a missionary, and he lands on the west coast of India, and he's excited. He's going to evangelize the people, to disciple them and teach them about Christ. There's only one little problem, if it's little at all. When he gets there, he hears a new word, parangi. And that's the word the locals use to refer to him. And he's like, okay. And he asks, what does parangi mean? And he gets 2 different answers. On one hand, parangi means Christian, but on the other hand, parangi means Portuguese. Okay, he's confused. He needs to understand this better. So he questions a few of the locals, and he finds out that, okay, he was aware the Portuguese have been in the area for quite a while, 50, 60, 70 years now, and the locals call them parangi. But at the same time, the locals use the word parangi to refer to Christians. So the question is parangi a Christian or Portuguese? If somebody calls Roberto di Nobili a parangi, should he say, no, I'm not a parangi, or should he say, yes, I'm a parangi? Well, he's a Christian, so yes, he's a parangi, but he's Italian, not Portuguese. So no, he's not a parangi. And in a sense, this is the problem we are trying to struggle with and tackle today. Were missionaries simply just missionaries, or were they colonialists? Did being European mean the same thing as being Christian in the 19th and 20th century when most of these missionaries were arriving? Were the missionaries genuinely out to share the gospel and plant churches in Africa and beyond, or were they simply agents of colonialism? Was Christianity a new faith that the world should hear, or was it simply a tool to dominate Africans, a tool to dominate people by the colonialist governments? Those are important questions for us to answer, especially because in our day and age, many Africans are looking back at their heritage and saying, we lost something, which is true, we did. And as a result, they are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The assumption is that whatever was handed down to us was not entirely genuine. The faith we have received is not entirely genuine. And I disagree with that view, and I hope over the next few minutes I'll be able to walk along with you and share with you why missionaries were not colonialists. This is an important question to answer because it helps us understand our own heritage. And without understanding your heritage, you can't understand yourself. So that's really important. It also gives us a tool to reach unreached Africans. Because when you go out to reach these unreached people, they might say, oh, you're just another colonialist coming to preach your colonialist message. And if it is true that Christianity was a guise for the colonialists, then we have a real problem. Those of us who are Christians have a real difficult issue to tackle. In our workshop today, I'll be basically introducing us to that, which I have already done. Then I will spend some time talking about colonialism, what made it colonialism and how it worked and what its goals were. And then I'll talk about missions in the same period. And then I'll sort of, as I draw to a conclusion, I'll compare and contrast. Those are the words we like using, right? I'll compare and contrast the two and actually give us a few take-homes. Why were they different, or where were they similar, and what can we learn from this? But before I jump right into that, I'd just like to remind us that our workshop is particularly focused on East Africa. Now, yes, we're thinking of unreached Africa, but There are 54 countries, and with all very different stories. That's difficult to tackle. So for the sake of focus, we'll be looking at 3 countries in Africa: Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, simply named in alphabetical order. And my bias will fall in Kenya because I'm a Kenyan in Kenya, right? But I'll be talking about Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. I may also have a little bias towards Protestants because 53.8% of all Kenyans are Protestants of one shape or the other, right? It may actually be a little higher. In Uganda, it's about 45%. So about half the population of Kenya and Uganda are Protestants. So I'll have a bit of bias towards them, but I'll definitely cite a few examples from the Roman Catholics and any others that there may be. As we think about the scope of our workshop, what we want to cover, we also want to think that we've talked about the geographical region, we've talked about the biases we'll have, but it's also important to know the period that we're covering. When we talk about colonialism, colonialism begins in the late 1880s. In Kenya and Uganda, it begins 1888 or thereabout. And it goes all the way early to the early 1960s. Tanzania received independence in 61, Uganda 62, Kenya 63. Missions, however, stretches a bit further back into the past. And I'll be discussing missions from about 1844. So already that's something to note. There's a slight difference in the time period being covered for colonialism and missions. With that said, let me just jump right in. The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that missionaries largely preceded colonialists in East Africa. Missionaries came first, then colonialists followed. Well, there had been some colonial efforts by the Portuguese in the 1600s down the East African coast. If you're a Kenyan and you learned GHC in primary school, you remember the Portuguese down at Mombasa, building Fort Jesus. If you've had the pleasure of visiting, it's a wonderful place to go. And there were those early colonial efforts, but colonialism proper came in the late 1800s, 1888 to be precise. And missions, on the other hand, started a bit earlier. Johann Ludwig Krapf, again from your GHC textbooks, if you're a Kenyan, arrived in Mombasa 1844. There may have been a few other guys before him, but he's the marker that I want to use. So there's a bit of a gap of about 40 years. Missionaries arrived close to 40 years before the colonialists arrived. And between the time missionaries arrived and the time colonialists arrived, a lot was happening. Missionaries were doing a lot, not just in Kenya, but in Uganda, in Tanzania. By the 1870s, Catholic missionaries had arrived in Uganda through Sudan. In the 1870s, southern Tanzania was full of the white fathers, Catholic missionaries, going towards Malawi. In the 1870s, they had already started building a cathedral in Zanzibar. By 1899, the Catholic fathers had reached Nairobi. Right? So clearly, in that 40-year gap, a lot was happening. Let's talk about colonialism for a minute. Colonialism was colonialism. A foreign nation coming in, dominating and subjecting the people that they conquer to their rule, to their way of life, and to whatever other things that they please. But for you to understand colonialism well, you need to have a backdrop. You need to have a sort of idea of what was happening in the world at that time. Around that time, in Europe, there was a very popular way of thinking called mercantilism. Mercantilism simply comes from the English word merchant. All right? So the idea of nations promoting merchantry, if there's such a word, mercantilism was very prominent, that European countries were seeking greater glory for themselves through trade, discovery, I put it in quotes because there were people there already, right? The growth of economic power, strategic and political interests, that was all within the mind of European nations. So colonialism was really just meeting that need. If we go out there and we have a colony, we have resources from there, we have people there, we have a political stake there, and the glory of our nation grows and grows and grows and grows. The second thing that was happening in the 1800s that really fueled colonialism is European countries were industrializing for the first time. The steam engine had been developed, other machines had been developed, rail transport had been developed, and so things were happening. European nations were full of factories, making goods for the mass market. So they needed raw materials, and they could easily be sourced in Africa, which was full of many raw materials. But not only raw materials, but markets for those raw materials, for the finished products. And so colonies were both a source of resources, but also a destination of finished products. So the European nations wanted places where they can get raw materials and sell them back to, and promote trade and grow the glory of their nations. That's quite difficult for some people to pronounce, grow the glory, right? Depending which mountain or river is near your shags. The start date of colonialism proper is 1885. Again, from your GHC, if you remember, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia, or what we call Germany today, gathers European nations in Berlin for a conference. And he's so creative and calls it the Berlin Conference. What a creative name. And they sit together and they sort of divide Africa amongst themselves. Britain, you take this. France, you take that. Belgium, you take that. Spain, you take the little you can get. And the reason was they wanted to divide up the African continent for exploitation, for their purposes, without having a fight. They'd been fighting a lot in Europe. They didn't need more war. And so he wanted to do it in a peaceful way, so they carved up Africa to fulfill their commercial and political interests. That's what we often call the scramble for Africa, right? And of course, the biggest winners were the British and the French, and after them, the Portuguese, I guess. Kenya and Uganda ended up as British territory, had been assigned to the British, and Tanzania was assigned to the Germans in 1886. The British had been in East Africa before the scramble for Africa. They had been especially on the coast, and the reason they were on the coast was to dismantle the Indian Ocean trade. David Livingstone had drawn attention to the Indian Ocean slave trade. Everybody's attention was in the West. The slaves going to America, right? Transatlantic slave trade, which was by far bigger. But there was a huge slave trade in the Indian Ocean that had gone unnoticed by Europeans for hundreds of years. And so he was pointing British attention to that. And so the British came to intervene and stop the trade. And so there was a relationship between the locals and the British to some degree. And so because the British wanted to expand their influence and grow the glory of the empire, they licensed a company called the Imperial British East Africa Company, IBEACO, to govern Kenya and Tanzania. And in 1894, Kenya and Uganda became a protectorate in 1894, Kenya in 1895. What that meant is the British were obligated to protect Kenya and Uganda in case of anything, because they had commercial interests there. Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi all went to the Germans. So that's colonialism in a nutshell, how it came in, right? World War I came shortly after 1914 to 1918. That had a lot of impact for Africans because the British and the Germans shipped off a lot of Africans to go fight their battles. Or they fought them right here in East Africa. Taita Taveta, northern Tanzania, southern Tanzania, there were also a lot of battles there. One of the interesting outcomes for that, especially in regard to Christianity, was this. Germany was the main aggressor in World War I. Britain was the main defender, right? And so when the British defeated the German-led coalition, the Axis powers, all German territories in Africa were reassigned to other nations. Cameroon was divided by the British and French. Tanzania was given to the British. Rwanda and Burundi ended up with the Belgians. So, as a result, all German missionaries in British-held territories were kicked out. You're a German, get out. Now, there's a problem here because German missionaries had been on the ground and they had set up missionary stations. What do you do with those mission stations? Do they remain empty? So what the British government did, it assigned those stations to friendly mission bodies. I'll give you an example of two here in Kenya. Mulango in Kitui and Ikuda also in Kitui were actually German Lutheran mission stations, but they were reassigned to the Africa Inland Mission, which was full of Brits and Germans. Sorry, Brits and Americans. So you have this uneasy political situation that's beginning to shape the way missions goes. Take note. So there's Colonialism and missions are not on two parallel paths. They mix and go their separate ways at different points. That's important for us to note. Now, I'd like to jump to the missionary section because this is the real meat of what we're talking about. And I'd like to discuss the missionaries in two groups or in two categories: their relationship to East Africans or Africans and their relationship to the colonialists. Right? They did have a relationship with both groups. By far and large, missionaries had a very positive interaction with Africans. There was a very positive interaction. And the first goal for the missionaries was to evangelize, to establish Christianity on African soil, to plant churches, to disciple people. That was the chief aim of missionaries, and they went far and wide doing this. Maybe what we need to hear a little more here is that most of the missionaries had African helpers, translators, guides. Those are the guys whose names were not written in the books, but they were there. And they did a lot of evangelism too. Aside from evangelism, missionaries really also wanted to do some form of societal transformation. They knew the gospel comes with a transformative force, a transformative power, and they wanted to see that translated into real life in Africa. Of course, they had contributed to the stopping of the slave trade. David Livingstone himself was a missionary. And so that was one way. But I think maybe one of the most lasting impacts of missionary activity in Africa was literacy and education. Missionaries were responsible for the development of writing systems for Africa. Now, many Africans had a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge, but they just didn't write it down. They're oral societies. We still are very oral. And so they would pass wisdom from generation to generation. So when an old man died, one library had been shut down, right? So what the missionaries do is they start trying to put those languages down on paper. And then they discover language X, Y, Z have sounds that are not there in my own mother tongue. And so we have to create a way of writing that sound, all right? And so missionaries developed these writing systems, in the books they call them orthographies of African languages, and they begin to be able to write African languages. What does that mean? You can now write your name, you can now write scripture. And so scripture begins to be translated as a result. The more translation and writing there is, the more the need for reading there is. So they begin to educate people. They start schools. One of the features of missionary activity all across Africa is schools. They, should I say, planted schools or established schools all over Africa, and were teaching people how to read. At the very least, the goal was to teach them how to read the Bible. You can read the Bible, you're good for life. At the very best, the goal was to teach them not just to read the Bible, but to read everything else so they can learn how to govern themselves in the new world. In fact, in countries like Kenya, the colonial government depended on the missionary schools to build an educational system. It was the nucleus of the educational system. They depended on the translators of scripture, those missionaries who were writing, and their assistants, to build literature and textbooks for children. So without the work the missionaries had done, the government couldn't have done what it did. So the missionaries actually come as a positive influence in Africa. Another area they had a lot of impact was in healthcare. Another feature of missionary work is hospitals, clinics, the dispensing of simple medicine like penicillin, which could save people's lives from infections that were curable. However, despite the many positive things, missionaries and Africans did have conflicts. They had beef sometimes, they had issues. One of the things that caused issues is when missionaries challenged local practices. They came and said, hey, that's contrary to the gospel, it can't happen. So, for example, polygamy, that was challenged far and wide. One of the best examples is in Uganda. The Anglicans and the Catholics are busy trying to evangelize the king. It's like a competition. And the king says, okay, both of you can baptize me. And they say, wait, you have to give up your extra wives. It's like, not so much. So you have issues around polygamy, missionaries conflicting with Africans because of things like that. In 1929, 1930 in Kenya, there was a big crisis called the Circumcision Crisis. The missionaries were challenging the Kikuyu tradition of circumcising the girls. And it was a huge, 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 huge crisis. And it really created lots of heat and fire between the missionaries and the local people. Now, maybe another conflict I can mention, and this is something worth noting. Sometimes, rather than allowing Africans to apply scripture to their own lives, to their own culture, to their own community, many missionaries often gave them what to apply. They often passed on a healthy dose of Western culture. And sometimes the challenge was Europeans had been Christians for over 1,000 years. They were struggling to separate their own culture and Christianity. Biblical teaching and cultural practice, they had become almost the same in European eyes. And so when they passed on their values, they passed on not just biblical teaching, but also Western thinking. And that became an issue, and is still an issue. For example, I give you 2 examples. Why must the preacher wear a tie on Sunday? Example number 2. Why do we think European style hymns are better than other songs? It's just a European style of music. Other styles of music can equally communicate the same message. So these are areas in which we are still struggling. And when we go to unreached Africa, these are the questions that come. And maybe some of these failings of the missionaries were, out of their own weaknesses as human beings, or because they had no tools to separate these things for themselves. Sometimes the missionaries and locals conflicted, the Africans conflicted because the missionaries supported European colonial policies, or they supported some decision at the expense of Africans. A very good example, the Kikuyu of Kijabe took a missionary organization to court because they had robbed them of land. Now, the missionary organization actually went to court to argue that they had genuinely, legitimately received the land. And so here you have people who are dispossessed of their land and a missionary body saying, God gave us this land to preach to the people in the land. But the people in the land are saying, you stole our land. So you have a bit of tension and conflict. This comes to a head in the 70s and 80s, post-independence. Some Africans begin to say, we actually don't need any Western missionaries in Africa anymore. Get out. And one of the loudest voices was a Kenyan voice, the late Reverend Dr. John Gatto of the Presbyterian Church of East Africa. So you had a lot of this back and forth, lots of positive but also negative things that creep in, right? Let me just talk about the relationship of the missionaries to the colonialists and then bring it to a close. Now, the missionaries and the colonialists had a lot of sharing interest. They shared some interests. They had overlapping interests. Maybe to start with, they came from the same countries. They were the same race. They even shared names. And so, for many Africans, when looking at a missionary and looking at a colonialist, they may not be able to distinguish clearly. It's a Parangi situation. Christian missionary, colonialist. They're from the same country. They worship the same God, same religion. They bear the same name. They have the same culture and religious heritage. It's difficult to separate. Sometimes the missionaries partnered with the colonial government. For example, the colonial government and the missionaries came together to work on education because the colonial government realized the missionaries have been doing this and they know what they're doing, and they've been doing it far longer and far better than us. And so they worked together to deliver a system of education for many Africans. Sometimes they work together for common goals. I was in the archives of a certain missionary organization, and I read a letter from one mission station leader to the district commissioner of Kiambu, asking him to build a road connecting 2 other major roads. And his argument was this: this will actually save you time and money in doing your administration. If you can just cross from point A to point B, it's easier than going all the way around. But in his mind as a missionary, he wanted the road built because it was going to cut through the forest and open new routes to new villages that had not been evangelized. So building the road is an agreed thing, but for different reasons. And so they come together with the colonialists to do that. So there was partnership in some areas, missionaries and colonialists. But as much as these partnerships were beneficial for the missionaries, sometimes they only served to cause more confusion for Africans because they brought the Parangi problem again. are you a missionary, are you a colonialist, or are you both? And that served to cause more confusion. However, the missionaries did have major conflicts with the colonialists. Many times, missionaries are the ones who defended Africans against colonial oppression. When colonial governments made rules and regulations that were anti-African, many times the missionaries opposed them. Sometimes they were successful, many times they were not. But the missionaries became sort of spokesmen for the Africans. Because of that shared heritage, they were able to stand before the colonialists with boldness and share their thoughts and share their views and defend African interests. Another thing is missionaries often wrote letters back home, and sometimes they had friends in powerful places. And so they would write to friends in their home governments and say, oh, your people on the ground are really doing this and that. Can you stop it? Can you push? And so they started lobbying for changes in the colony by writing to the government in their home countries. British missionaries writing to the British government saying, no, your colonial government has got it wrong in area A, B, C. Can you please effect changes for the good of the Africans? This was particularly effective in South Africa and West Africa, not in East Africa. Sometimes the missionaries just outrightly challenged colonial authorities. When they were implementing policies that were harmful, they would be in the forefront for Africans and they would challenge them. When they were also implementing policies that would hurt missions, they were very, very loud and vocal. If you make a decision that means I can't evangelize and plant churches as I should, then I'll make noise about it. And the colonialists were not actually always fond of missionaries. Actually, most of the time, they didn't like them at all. Case in point, in the early 1900s in Kenya, a new missionary organization had started, and they came and they wanted a base. And so they had chosen an area near Naivasha. It's the Africa Inland Mission. And when they got there, they found a colonial person there. His name was Lord Delamere. And Delamere said, not on my land, not near me. Get away, you missionaries. He really just said, you can't be near me. I don't want you here. I don't like you at all. Because what you're coming to do will undermine what I am trying to do. So the African Inland Mission moved back closer to Nairobi and got some land at Kijabe, which is a major center for the African Inland Church till today. Now, let me just bring all those stories into a few take-homes for you. A few things that you can, just pack in a small package and go home with. Missionaries often failed to separate biblical teaching from the cultural form that teaching was practiced in the West. I'll use the example of music, for example. Some missionaries struggled to separate biblically sound music from the style of music that it was written in. And so rather than let Africans express biblical truth in African styles and forms, they said, no, you must sing it like this, like a Western hymn. Dressing is another one. Right? A good Christian cannot keep wearing that shuka or that skin. A good Christian will wear a shirt and a tie and, if you're lucky, trousers. If you're not, a short. Right? And so their goal was really not to, in most cases, was not to make Europeans out of the Africans, but that's effectively what they were doing without realizing it. So that's a negative, and we cannot present it as otherwise. Missionaries also often made decisions based on their contribution to the chief goal. Their chief goal was to evangelize and establish the church here, even when it meant partnering with the colonialists. So this simply created the Parangi confusion. You remember the Parangi story? Where Parangi means European and it means Christian at the same time. So Africans who are looking are struggling to separate. Is this a Christian action or it's a European action? Or are they the same thing? So when the missionaries would partner with the colonialists, they had good reasons to. It favored them. But at the same time, it created confusion for Africans. Major issue. But let me talk about a few of the good things that we can take home. Number one, let's remember the missionaries got here first. They got here first. Getting here first doesn't mean much unless you came with a different intention. And that's the second thing I'd like us to note. The intentions of the missionaries were very different from the intentions of the colonialists. They came from the same countries, same towns, same villages, same families, but they had divergent goals. The missionaries were here to evangelize African peoples, to plant the Church of Christ here. The colonialists were here to grow the glory of their nations. So you have two opposite, very different objectives and intentions for coming to Africa. It happens that around the time the colonialists checked in, there was a huge influx of missionaries. So sometimes people think, oh, the 1880s and 90s, that's when most missionaries came, that's when the colonialists came. Aha, they must be in cahoots. The reality is they weren't, because they had different goals, different motivations for coming. Many of the missionaries believed that they had a very positive view of the world, and they believed they had a post-millennial eschatology, and they thought the world is only getting better and better, then Jesus will come. And so that meant, let's go and evangelize every single people there is. And people left their homes to go and evangelize. Also, Protestants had not been doing missions as well as the Catholics up to this point. So now they have the muscle, they have the organization, they have the resources to do it, so they're doing it like never before. And unfortunately, at the same time, the colonialist is coming to grow the glory of his nation. Another positive, missionaries often acted as advocates for Africans against oppressive colonialism. I think that's a good thing. Missionaries often stood up for the Africans and championed their cause in the face of the colonialists, which caused them problems with the colonialists as well. In some cases, the colonialists actually kicked out missionaries from the mission field. Said, go back home, we don't need you here, causing too much trouble for us. Maybe lastly, missionaries were significant players in the story of education and healthcare in East Africa. They were not the only guys doing it, but they were at the forefront. They were at the forefront, and that's a good thing, I think. So, missionaries or colonialists? I'd say there are mixed outcomes for the missionaries, very mixed, some positive, some negative. And I think that's a good reflection that we are not perfect. None of us is perfect. We will often make mistakes here and there, as the missionaries did. And so let's treat them with a dose of mercy as well. But these mixed outcomes don't tip the scale. The scale is swinging clearly in the balance of missionaries were not colonialists. That, for me, is the end of the story. Missionaries were not colonialists. I hope that the stories I've shared and the examples I've given are useful in helping you see the difference between missionaries and colonialists. So when your church goes to an unreached people group and shares the gospel with them, they can actually say, they were not colonialists. Maybe we can also try and watch out for the mistakes they made and try and rectify those in our engagement and encounters with unreached people groups. There are still many in Kenya. I think about 30 now. There were 31. One has moved to underreached. But it's reached, but underreached. So my prayer for all of us is that as we think about reaching unreached Africa, let's keep this in mind, the historical element, because it's part of the story. We cannot ignore it. We cannot bury our heads in the sand. So with that, I'd like to call our workshop a wrap, call it a wrap, and bring it to a close. I hope it was useful for you, enjoyable for you. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the plenary sessions and the workshop sessions at Proclaim 2021. May the Lord help us to reach unreached Africa. Thank you.